This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. I want to take a moment to tell you about a podcast from the Shalom Hartman Institute called Identity Crisis. This podcast is creating better conversations about the essential issues facing Jewish life. It's hosted by Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, who sits down with a wide range of guests, politicians, authors, writers, and more to discuss current events, Jewish values, and the big questions facing Jewish life. This podcast has a genuine curiosity and humility about the critical and complex issues, everything from what it means to be a Jewish leader during this divisive moment to the experience of being a Palestinian in Israel today. You will find Identity Crisis enriching and enlivening. Check it out, Identity/Crisis with Yehuda Kurtzer, wherever you get your podcasts. Hey everyone, Jody Abergan here. Welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. Now on Sundays, from time to time, we try and do these episodes that we call Some Sunday Context, giving you a little historical perspective on the big stories of the moment. And Lord knows, coming off the week we just had, we need some perspective. One of the big stories this past week was that we saw a number of Supreme Court rulings that are redefining executive power and judicial power, offering support for many of the moves that the Trump administration is taking, and maybe more importantly, undermining some of the checks on those moves from the judiciary. Thinking about that and thinking about some important perspective, I almost reran an episode here that we did on court packing, attempts to try and reshape and expand the court in order to rebalance power. Because a lot of people, at least a lot of progressives, think that one of the only ways to really turn things around, given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, will be to reshape the judiciary. So we're not going to run that here, but if you want to go listen to the episode we did on FDR's failed attempt to pack the courts, you can go find that in the archives. We'll post a link to it on social and in the newsletter. But instead, for some context today, here is an episode tied to 4th of July. It is indeed 4th of July week here in the United States, and yes, it's a great time for barbecues and beaches and swimming, and I will be doing all three of those later this week. But I suppose it's as good of a time as any to also think about this country's founding principles, founding documents, and that thorny question about what this American experiment of ours is really all about. So here's an episode we did about an anti-slavery protest that took place on the 4th of July in 1854, and how it ties into all these big questions about what our Constitution and our founding documents say about slavery, universal rights, and the struggle for freedom. I really love this episode. It gives you a lot to think about, and it reinforces for me that you can talk about the Constitution and this country's founding as the culmination of a higher ideal of freedom, and you're going to hear a lot of that every 4th of July. Or you can think of this country's birth as just the beginning of a very imperfect and ongoing struggle for more and more rights for more and more people. And I think you know what I'll be thinking about this 4th of July. Now, before we run this episode, one other little sneak preview. Later this week, around the 4th of July, on the 3rd and then on the 6th, we're going to run some episodes that kind of kick off our coverage of this whole America 250th anniversary thing, which is really going to start in earnest this week, as I think you'll notice, and then will culminate next summer in 2026. So I'm just giving you a heads up to check out those episodes. We just recorded them a couple days ago. They are super interesting. But if you want to get in on the new plans, I will say this, sign up for our newsletter. Go to thisdaypod.com, sign up. We've got some really cool things brewing there, which we will talk about. thisdaypod.com. Got the plan? Episode from the archives right now. New episode on Tuesday, then Thursday and Sunday, a 4th of July special about America's upcoming 250th birthday. Very exciting stuff. Anyway, here we go with William Lloyd Garrison and his 4th of July protest. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Abergan. This day, July 4th, 1854, William Lloyd Garrison burned a copy of the Constitution. He said, quote, "The Constitution of the United States of America is the source and parent of all other atrocities, a covenant with death and an agreement with hell." Garrison was, of course, talking about the institution of slavery here and how the Constitution, in his view, supported the institution of slavery. He was perhaps the most well-known anti-slavery crusader of the time, and in this quote, an act was voicing something that a lot of abolitionists felt. For decades, some abolitionists had been arguing that the institution of slavery would not withstand close scrutiny of the founding documents, but now Garrison and others had come to believe the opposite, that the Constitution was in fact being used to preserve slavery. So, here to discuss Garrison's activism, the way in which the Constitution was and is, I will mention, contested on the question of slavery, and the various abolitionist arguments of the time are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, Kelly, not to dive right into the stickiest of questions here, but, we've talked a lot about the sort of spectrum of abolitionist and anti-slavery arguments being made in this period. But I'm fascinated by this notion of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, an anti-slavery document, and in particular, I think what I tried to get at in the intro, this notion that, some people had put their hopes in the idea that the Constitution would bear out an anti-slavery argument, but then maybe starting to change and realize, oh no, an anti-slavery argument actually needs to confront the Constitution head on.
Yeah. I mean, part of the problem is that the Constitution is ambiguous. So it's not clear, not crystal clear anyways, in terms of how it operates around the institution of slavery. In fact, the word slavery is not even mentioned in the U.S. Constitution until you get to the 13th Amendment, which abolishes the institution of slavery. So for a lot of people, there's a great debate over whether the Constitution is pro-slavery or anti-slavery. And so the abolitionists in particular can't seem to get consensus around this. All they know is that the institution of slavery has to be abolished. But politically, as things start to unfold and as the country becomes more and more contentious over the institution of slavery, especially when we start talking about statehood and expansion and what becomes free state and slave state, and you get these high profile fugitive slave cases, the Constitution becomes much more into play.
And one of the things that Kelly is pointing at is that, there's this philosophical debate about the nature of the Constitution, but the Constitution had been in place for 65 years, and functionally what had happened? Slavery had expanded into new territories. The number of people who were enslaved in the United States had grown rapidly. It had become more important to the U.S. economy. And now you had things like the Fugitive Slave Law that threatened to nationalize slavery even more so than it already was. And so I think that there are two levels at which the argument is happening, but one of the things that the abolitionists could all point to was that the Constitution as a document, as enacted, was not doing much to slow or stop the spread of slavery.
Do you feel like Garrison ever put his hopes in the Constitution? Maybe this is a chance to flesh out sort of his personality and his. But do you think he ever sort of said, well, maybe the Constitution will help win this argument? Or was he just like...
I don't think so. I mean, Garrison was very anti-government, very anti-establishment in a lot of ways. He thought that voting was a sin. He was never very politically engaged, although he does vote for Lincoln in the 1864 election. But he is adverse when it comes to anything political. And I think that's where he butts heads with a lot of abolitionists, because a lot of these major abolitionists are elected officials. They're senators and Republicans, if you think of Thaddeus Stevens or Charles Sumner. So they're not aligned in that way. But Garrison was always very contrarian.
His newspaper was The Liberator. He was based in Boston, we should say that, founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society. I'm fascinated by the sort of Boston anti-slavery milieu versus maybe New York, and I wonder if there's a distinction there. I don't know, Nikki. What else do we need to know about the kind of circles in which Garrison is trafficking?
Yeah, I mean, Kelly can certainly expand on this much more, but New York... There certainly were abolitionists in New York, but New York was also a stronghold of people who supported slavery. There was a movement within New York City during the war to secede because they were so caught up in the cotton trade and so dependent on slavery as the economic engine of the city. And so it's quite different in Boston, which is more tied to a Puritan religious tradition, where you have preachers who are deeply embedded in the abolition movement, and intellectuals and activists. And so Boston is the beating heart in many ways of the abolition movement in the U.S., and New York City is not really a player here.
No, that's the perfect way to sort of set it up. I mean, when I think of the abolitionist movement, I think of Boston really being the capital of that. Philadelphia might be a close second, but I think that's also because of the Quaker presence and of how religion plays a role in the region in which people are living. Ohio is another abolitionist bastion, but for the most part, people are following the lead of what happens in Boston.
And this particular incident where he burns the Constitution does seem like, well, it just seems like something Garrison would do on the 4th of July. Just, that seems to be his style. But it is also precipitated a bit by the capturing of a fugitive slave, Anthony Burns. You want to talk a little bit about that incident?
So Anthony Burns is actually a fugitive slave from Virginia, and he escapes to Boston, finds a job, sort of sets up his life, and foolishly writes his brother saying, hey, guess what? I'm in Boston. Life is good. And pretty much sets U.S. Marshals on his trail so that when they come to Boston and they find him and they arrest him, it becomes a huge public controversy. And so all of the Underground Railroad and the people involved in the abolitionist movement sort of alert one another and say, did you hear about Anthony? He's been arrested. He's in jail. They're going to send him back to the South. They make attempts to rescue him. Those attempts fail. There's a U.S. Marshal who's actually killed in the process of that mob attack. And the United States president at the time basically says, listen, we are going to make a show of force. They send over 2,000 troops to Boston to ensure that Anthony Burns will be sent back to the South. They spend, I think, about $40,000 making sure that this happens, which essentially makes Anthony Burns like the most expensive slave ever purchased by the United States government. So it's a lot that goes into that. But because it was such a public display, Boston explodes, and they hang flags upside down. They have a coffin that says "Here lies liberty." I mean, people are sort of publicly grieving in the streets at the loss of Anthony Burns and this man who will be returned back to his slaveholder.
Risk is the show where people tell true stories they never thought they'd dare to share. A podcast all about human connection and radical honesty. All through June for Pride Month, Risk will be featuring the stories of LGBTQ folks from all walks of life. You'll laugh, cry, and maybe even end up feeling a little bit better. Go get Risk on the Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcasts.
When you check in on the news each day, doesn't it kind of feel like every story is a head-spinning economic story? Tariffs, meme coins, budget fights, not to mention groceries and gas prices. Economics is everywhere, fueling our lives even where you least expect it. You're a This Day listener, which means I know you love context and hidden history. Well, Planet Money is the show for you. Planet Money recently did an episode that I absolutely loved, all about the more uncommon economic indicators being discussed on social media. Not just the obvious like prices, but sales of lipstick are going up, babysitter buns are coming back into style. A show like Planet Money is built to dig into all the little ways that economics shapes our lives. Every episode of Planet Money is fun, illuminating, and pretty short. 20-ish minutes, and you'll walk away knowing a lot more about how the world really works. Listen now to Planet Money from NPR.
Some stories are etched in baseball's history. But what if we've been telling them all wrong? How did a Hollywood producer find his father while casting Field of Dreams? And how did a simple game of catch, played for 1,000 days straight, lead to a cultural phenomenon? If you love baseball, but love the stories behind it even more, check out Midnight Library of Baseball.
I I gather that Garrison and a lot of members of the Anti-Slavery Society had rallies on July 4th every year for a couple of decades. This one becomes particularly explosive, I think, because of the context you're describing. Sojourner Truth is there. Henry David Thoreau is there. Hundreds of people are there. And the climax is this moment where Garrison burns a copy of, I think, the Fugitive Slave Act and the United States Constitution. And, you know, he says, "We're called here to celebrate the 78th anniversary of American independence. In what spirit, with what purpose, to what end?"
It's such a passionate display. I mean, when he takes the fugitive slave law and sets it on fire and then says, "And let the people say amen." And everyone's like, "Amen, amen." I mean, like, everyone is responding jubilantly to this act, this really controversial act.
Yeah, it's remarkable that he got the kind of support, and it shows you just how with him the audience of abolitionists really were. It's also, I think, instructive to compare it to a speech given 2 years earlier by Frederick Douglass on the 4th of July. The 4th of July really was this moment that called people to speak about the nature of the country and the nature of the country's founding documents. And when Frederick Douglass is talking about it, he points to the gap between the professed ideas of the Declaration of Independence and how people are treated in slavery, and that gap that needs to be reconciled. Here, Garrison is saying, nope, the Constitution and slavery go hand in hand. And if you want to get rid of one, you're going to have to get rid of the other.
So I suppose we should loop back around to that central question of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, an anti-slavery document, a contested document, in part because this is still coming up now, and it is coming up in the sort of swirl of this critical race theory argument. And I will try and articulate one of the arguments around that. That's why they pay me the big bucks. I will now swallow my pride and articulate an anti-critical race theory argument as I see it in order to then set up, hopefully, an instructive conversation. But it goes something along the lines of, you know, this critical race theory stuff teaches that all of the founders were racist and this country was based on basic racism, and these great founders of our country were deeply racist, and the Constitution is a racist document. To which there is, I think, a reasonable response, which I will let you flesh out, that goes, it's a little more complicated than that. So how do we start to dive into that, and how do you see it still being played out?
Yeah. It is complicated, though, because the Constitution is not explicit, and that's intentional. There is room for interpretation, and there is room to sort of see how it evolves in its cultural moment. But there's also a lot of reason, given the founding fathers' background, given that the majority of them were slaveholders, that George Washington is a slaveholder, Thomas Jefferson is a slaveholder. The first 4 out of 5 U.S. presidents are slaveholders. That adds a lot of texture in terms of how we understand the way that they intended to create these laws and these ideas.
I think it's important to continue to point also to that gap between, what the Constitution says, how explicit or implicit it is, but in actual experience, what happens? In a way, Garrison was right. Like, politics wasn't the solution for ending slavery. It took a war, which was the failure of politics. Even with all of the Reconstruction amendments added to the Constitution, that didn't do away with racism. It didn't do away with racist laws. There was still plenty of space for those laws to be enacted. And there are still today plenty of spaces within the Constitution, within the legal system, for racist laws and outcomes to be enshrined in the justice system. And so,
even with the 13th Amendment, I mean, there's this caveat for criminality that is so, sort of understated in terms of how we think about the 13th Amendment is, it abolishes slavery, except if you commit a crime. And that's when mass incarceration plays a major role in how we understand this amendment that is supposed to free people from all bondage.
Right. And I think this gets at, I think what I see as a critical divide in the way that we just even define racism, which is, thinking of it as a moral failing versus, a structural presence that leads to particular outcomes. And both are worth looking at and discussing, but I think there needs to be a distinction there. And I think some people, I sort of am sympathetic to this argument, say it's at this point, it's somewhat incidental whether a founding father was deeply racist or not. Look at the outcomes. And I think there's also a sort of related argument that in many ways you can look at the document as in some ways trying to manage an economic system of slavery. The Constitution is trying to manage an economic system of slavery and not really concerned with core moral issues, but it's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we can say fairly definitively is that the Constitution is not an anti-slavery document. Right. There was nothing in its operation that made it anti-slavery. And so now we're arguing around the margins of, was it explicitly pro-slavery, or was it they had to accommodate pro-slavery founders, and the document that you get out of that simply cannot be an anti-slavery document.
And even if you want to do away with anti-slavery, it's still anti-black. So so the idea of the 3/5 compromise, you're not quite a person, according to the Constitution, not fully 5/5 a person, is something that also has to be confronted.
Yeah. And I come back to an episode we did about the Confederate Constitution and that simple fact that when the Confederacy went to write their Constitution, they found it quite easy to take the existing Constitution and change a few little words and have it be a completely accommodating pro-slavery document. And so I think that's...
a few words and some punctuation.
Exactly.
That's all they needed.
So one small thing, and I'm also realizing as we do this, is the first time we've really talked about Garrison. We haven't talked about Thoreau, and his name came up just because he was obviously part of this scene and was speaking at this event. Tell me if you think I'm wrong, because I don't know a ton about Thoreau here, but in reading accounts of this July 4th ceremony where Garrison really, goes for it, it sounds to me, maybe I make it, but that Thoreau kind of gets caught up in the spirit a little bit too, because he comes on after Garrison and he starts to really rabble-rouse, but he's up there trying to whip people up too. So I just like the notion that Garrison is one of these figures who, if you're around him, you're just, it's fever pitch.
Yeah.
The spirit moves you.
Yeah. I think he had that impact on a lot of people. Certainly Douglass did. Certainly Sojourner Truth did. I mean, there is a reason they were called radical. And I think it's because you had to be radical to stand up to something like the institution of slavery. You couldn't just call it bad. People knew it was bad. Slaveholders knew it was wrong. And they didn't care, So, I mean, they really had to not just gin up a moral sort of wrongdoing. They had to show politically, economically, socially, the harm that slavery caused in order for people to be invested in wanting to abolish it.
I suppose we can end. Look, this is our 4th of July episode. I hope people are eating their burgers and having a good time. But I will also end on this, I think, very impactful quote from Frederick Douglass. I think this is a couple years earlier, but where he says, "I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. The 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn." So something to think about on this Independence Day. And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.